All right, time for section 4. Here's your focus question. The Depression ensured that Americans would face, in the words of one writer, a reckoning with liberty. FDR declared that for too many Americans, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real, men no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. Most Americans assumed that liberty required a new meaning. The New Deal transformed the idea of freedom by tying it to the growing power of the national government. Roosevelt was not just a master politician, but also a brilliant communicator, and with his opponent controlling most of the newspapers, he turned to the radio to reach Americans with weekly broadcasts called fireside chats in order to build support for his policies. FDR adopted old terms and ideas to defend his innovative policies, most notably liberalism, which he redefined as a government that was large, active, and socially conscious. In his second fireside chat, Roosevelt contrasted the older notion of liberty as liberty of contract, which served the privileged few, to his definition of the concept as greater security for the average man. He continued to positively associate freedom with economic security and identify economic inequality as its greatest foe. Yet a concept of liberty defined as freedom from powerful government animated his opponents. They argued that New Deal spending undermined fiscal responsibility and that new regulations suppressed American freedom. Conservative businessmen and politicians formed an organization, the American Liberty League, to oppose his policies. As the 1930s went on, his opponents increasingly employed the language of liberty to paint FDR as a dictator who threatened traditional American freedoms. By 1936, politics reflected class divisions more than at any other point in American history. Working class voters provided large majorities for the Democratic Party, and large and small businessmen were alienated from the New Deal. Americans divided over their definitions of liberty. One magazine editor said that citizens had two opposing concepts of liberty, one based on free enterprise and the other a socialized liberty based on an equality of wealth and goods. A fight over the ideal of freedom defined the 1936 presidential campaign. The Democrats insisted that in a modern economy, the government is obliged to guarantee a democracy of opportunity for all. Roosevelt, in his speech accepting the nomination, attacked economic royalists who intended to establish a tyranny over ordinary people. He insisted that economic rights were the precondition for liberty and that poor men are not free men. Moreover, he argued that large corporations constituted a new despotism that threatened economic freedom. FDR faced a Republican nominee and former Kansas Governor Alfred Landon, who denounced Social Security and other New Deal programs as a threat to individual liberty. Roosevelt, however, won by a landslide, carrying every state except for Maine and Vermont. Strong support from organized labor and his ability to unite Southern whites and Northern blacks, Protestant farmers and urban Catholic and Jewish ethnics, and industrial workers and middle-class homeowners won him the election. These groups formed the so-called New Deal coalition, which dominated American politics for the next 50 years. At his inauguration, FDR admitted that the Depression was not over and promised to do more to help the significant minority of Americans who were still in need of assistance. Encouraged by his massive victory, Roosevelt committed what many believe was an enormous error. Arguing that several Supreme Court justices were too old to perform their functions, he proposed that the president be allowed to appoint a new justice for each who remained on the court past age 70, which was 6 at the time. FDR's goal was to change the balance of power on a court that might invalidate Social Security, the Wagner Act, and other parts of the Second New Deal. Immediately, however, the president was criticized as an aspiring dictator. Congress rejected the plan, but Roosevelt's court-packing threat seemed to persuade the court to accept economic regulation by the state and federal governments. The court soon upheld the minimum wage law, affirmed federal power to regulate wages, hours, and child labor, and rejected challenges to Social Security and the Wagner Act. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes said that while the term freedom of contract did not appear in the Constitution, liberty did, and it required legal protections against social evils that menaced the people's welfare. The Second New Deal slowed after the court-packing fight. Although the Housing Act, passed in 1937, signaled the first major effort to build homes for the poorest in America, the Fair Labor Standards Bill in 1938, which banned goods produced by child labor, set a minimum wage, and required overtime pay for more than 40 hours of work per week, languished in Congress for a year before it passed. This bill established federal regulation of wages and working conditions in a radical departure from pre-Depression policies. In 1937, the economy slumped sharply after FDR, who saw economic improvements in 36, decreased federal farm and WPAA work relief. This caused business investment, production, and stocks to also fall and unemployment to rise. In 1936, in The General Theory of Employment, Interests, and Money, John Maynard Keynes criticized economists' commitment to balanced budgets. He argued that massive government spending was needed, even at the cost of deficits, to sustain purchasing power and stimulate economic activity during downturns. By 1938, Roosevelt had adopted this solution, which became known as Keynesian economics, and he asked Congress for billions for more work relief and farm aid. The New Deal had shifted from economic planning to economic redistribution and then to public spending. The second New Deal was over. All right, that was our fourth section. We'll be back with section 5.